On a scale of 1 to 10, if 1 is you lying in a hammock on a beach on a Caribbean island, taking a nap with a nice tall Arnold Palmer drink next to your side with an umbrella sticking out of it, and 10 is you being chased across a field by a swarm of angry hornets, that's our continuum, how chaotic is your life? What number would you assign your life on our chaos scale? Some of you might say, Jason, my life is pretty simple right now. Things are good, maybe a 2, maybe a 3. Some of you might say, my wheels didn't just fall off. First they blew out, burned up, and then they fell off, and I am running at a 9 right now, okay? I hear the swarm getting closer. Some of you might say, it's kind of hard to say because different parts of my life are at such different places, and, maybe when it comes to work, things are at an 8 or 9, or maybe at work things are a 2 or 3, and things are great at work, and you're advancing in your career, and things are going forward, and people look up to you and admire you, but maybe at home it's an 8 or a 9, because things aren't good at home. Or maybe it's a season where most things are good, but there's some areas of your past that are starting to catch up to your present. Maybe it's with some relationship baggage from your past, or maybe it's with some financial decisions you made in your past. So some areas of life are lower, some areas of your life are higher, but as you think about the areas of your life, how chaotic is your life today? Today, we are in the last part of the first part of a 2-part series on the life of Moses, and if you are not confused, you just aren't paying attention, quite frankly. And the reason why we are taking a series and breaking it into 2 chunks this summer is because things are chaotic around here this summer. Most of you already know. This week, this floor in this room is going to be refinished, and we're going to be out of the building for 3 consecutive Sundays, so we'll get more information out to you later, but next Sunday there's no services. We checked all the inns. There is no room in the inn, all right? We have nowhere to go next Sunday. We're going to put something online for you guys to watch. And then the next 2 Sundays, July 1st and July 8th, we're going to be at the Economwalk Art Center, so thankfully we were able to get that venue. There's going to be 1 service on those 2 weekends. So for our staff, we're running a solid 7 or 8 on the chaos scale right now, but they're doing a great job keeping on top of everything. But the reason why I ask about your level of chaos, and we'll come back and then, so what we're doing is for this 2 weeks in the Art Center, we're going to have a standalone series that's 2 weeks long, and then when we're back in here, we'll finish the life of Moses. But in today's episode of the life of Moses, we learn something about chaos in our lives. We learn where it comes from, and more importantly, we learn how to address the chaos that we discover in our lives. And now, if you missed the last 2 weeks, let me give you a little background. We heard the origin story of Moses. He was a man who brought a ray of hope to his people, and the reason why was because when Moses was born, it was a time of oppression for the Hebrew people. There is an Egyptian ruling dynasty that was afraid of the Israelite nation. They found them to be prosperous and they were growing in numbers, so they oppressed them and forced them into slavery in their foreign land of Egypt. They had them build storehouse cities for Pharaoh. And into that oppression, Moses was born. And the reason why he was a ray of hope was that although he was a Hebrew and he identified with his Hebrew people, at the same time he was raised in the court as a grandson of Pharaoh himself. He was raised with all the access and influence and wealth and education of a prince of Egypt. The problem was when Moses was 40 years old, he had in his heart to liberate his people, but he totally blew everything, made a mess of everything, because one day he lost his temper. He saw a slave driver beating one of his fellow Hebrews, and he just lost his cool. He attacked the slave driver, killed him, and what he did became known. He had to run away for his life. He literally ran away into the desert with the shirt on his back. And he spent the next 40 years of his life following a flock of sheep around the desert, and they weren't even his sheep. They belonged to his father-in-law. 40 years of detour in his life, realizing he messed up everything. But only at that point was he ready to meet God, when his pride was stripped away and he finally learned humility. And only at that point was God ready to call him to go and do a great deed in the name of the Lord. And he said, Moses, you're going to go now. Now you're an 80-year-old man. Now you're going to go back to Pharaoh, and you are going to tell him it's time for my people to go. So Moses and his brother Aaron, they're like, okay, God, they go back to the land of Egypt. They go to the elders of the Hebrew people first, and they say, guys, we're with the rebellion. We're here to rescue you. And the people are like, praise the Lord. For decades we've been praying to God to answer our prayers, and finally he has sent someone to liberate us. And then Moses and Aaron go before the most powerful man in the world in their generation with a demand for him, and they have no leverage and no army for the request they are going to make. But the reason why I think this is worth the price of your attention is because in this episode, we learn where chaos in our lives comes from, and we learn how to resolve the chaos that exists in our life. So we have an ambitious goal today. We're going to cover 5 chapters of the Bible. That's right. We'll get you out on time for your barbecue or your tea time, whatever you have today. Don't worry about that. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but it's all to answer this question about chaos and where it comes from. So we're going to pick it up in Exodus chapter 5, where we're told, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. But the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. Now, it's not a big surprise that their request for time off was denied by the boss. What is, however, very helpful is the fact that in his denial, Pharaoh asked an important question. And the question that he asked that we want to pay attention to was this. He asked, who is the Lord that I should obey him? Now, he is not asking this question as an atheist. In this culture, there were very few, if any at all, atheists. He's asking this question from the perspective of a spiritual pluralist, and here's where that's different. Atheists believe there is no God. All there is to this life is this life in the material world that we live in. But spiritual pluralists say, hey, there's many views of God, there's many approaches to spirituality. You do whatever works for you, and I'll do whatever works for me, but you cannot go to anybody else and say, your view of spirituality is wrong, my view of spirituality is right, because that's oppressive, that's intolerant, that's the wrong thing to do. Just let everybody do whatever they want to do. Pharaoh's coming from a perspective of, hey, we have our Egyptian gods. You have your Hebrew God, and why should I listen to your God when I already have my gods? In fact, why should I listen to your God when your God isn't even coming through for you? See, my gods seem to be doing all right by me. I'm the king. You, however, are enslaved. So who is the Lord that I should listen to him? And it's a fabulous question. It's an honest question. But it's a question that most of us are asking consciously or subconsciously, but we're not being as honest about it. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. God says to all people, be generous people. And there's something intuitive inside of us that knows, yeah, it's good to be generous. We should be generous people. But God does not say, be generous with your intentions. He doesn't say be generous with your desires. He doesn't say, mean to be generous. He says be generous with your dollars. Don't be generous with your heart. Be generous with your dollars. Give away 10% or more of what you have towards the people who are making our world a better place, towards the charities that are dealing with problems of poverty, towards the ministries that are changing people's lives and eternities. Give away 10% of your dollars or more. Be generous people. And if you don't do that, I know why. Because you can justify why you don't. It's not hard to do. Oh, we're just getting started. off in life, and we don't have the money yet. We have debt that we're paying off, so we want to be generous. We're generous in our hearts, but we're not generous yet because we're still in debt and we're paying our way out of debt. Or we want to be generous, but we've got kids right now, and kids are so expensive, and we've got college coming up, and we need to save our money for that, and we're not prepared for retirement, and we had a setback at work. Or some people say, well, I'm not generous with my money, but I'm generous in other ways. I'm generous with my time. But just so you know, if you peel back the layers of your justification for why you choose to not be generous with your dollars, do you know what you have when you peel back the layers? Who is the Lord that I should obey him? That's the question you're asking. God said, do this. You're saying, who's the Lord that I should obey him? Or let me give you another example. God says, when people hurt you, when they stab you in the back, when they drag your name through the mud, you must forgive them. He doesn't say try to forgive them. He doesn't say you really ought to forgive them. He says you must forgive them. And then if you don't, I know why you don't. Because you can justify not forgiving them. They hurt you too badly. They don't deserve your forgiveness. It hurts too much. And because you can justify it, you don't forgive them. But if we peel back the layers of your justification, at the core of that, here's what you're going to find. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? Now, we could go on with dozens of examples this morning, but that's just a couple to help you start to thinking about areas in your life where if you are a Jesus follower, you say, yep, I know there's a command from God, I ought to do this. Or if you don't consider yourself to be a Jesus follower, just go with your own conscience and what your conscience even says is right or wrong and you really ought to and you really shouldn't. What we're really asking in these areas of life when we know the good we ought to do, but we do not do it, we are asking this question, who is the Lord that I should obey him? My goal is to make us honestly ask the question. Let's drop the justification, the self-justification. Let's get right to the heart of it today. Let's answer this question with Pharaoh. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? Because everything that follows in Exodus chapter 5 through Exodus chapter 12 is God's answer to this question. Apparently, God thought it was a great question because he is going to take a lot of time to unpack it and give a very thorough yet precise answer to this question. And as we answer it today, as we look at God's answer to this question, for most of us, I think it's going to change the way we think about God. It's going to change the way we think about the things God asks us to do. So that's what we want to do. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? We're going to figure out the answer to that question. The answer comes in the form of the 10 plagues. So we see the first plague here. We're going to cover 9 of them today, and we're not going to cover all of them. This is something to read at home on your own. I'm just going to give you an overview of it. Exodus chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the river. Confront him on the bank of the Nile and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now, you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. Now, for years, scholars have argued about what this actually means. Does it literally mean that the entire Nile River was transformed into blood, or is it a metaphor that means that the water of the Nile somehow became contaminated and toxic and was undrinkable. Whichever one it meant, what all the commentators agree on is this. What this first plague triggers is something that is an utterly natural chain reaction and sequence of events. The first plague destroys the ecosystem of the Nile River. Then, after the ecosystem is destroyed, frogs come out in teams and in droves out of the Nile River. And they come into people's homes and into their kitchens and into their beds, and there's frogs everywhere. And then all the frogs die, and there's millions of frog carcasses all over the cities of Egypt. This follows, what follows this are two plagues, one of gnats and one of flies. And these are followed by two epidemics, one on livestock and then one on the people. And people notice that there's an utter naturalness to what's going on here. And then with the next two plagues, there's a shift. There's no connection to the previous ones, but they're still completely natural. There's a hailstorm that comes to Egypt, and then there's a locust swarm that devours everything between the hail and the locust. Everything that is edible growing in the land of Egypt is absolutely destroyed. There's something utterly natural about the 10 plagues. In fact, there's something so natural about them that it's not exactly winning Pharaoh over to say, oh, that's who the Lord is, that I should listen to him. That's who the Lord is, that I should obey him. Because when he looks at them from the certain angle, he can say, yeah, maybe that's just coincidence. Sure, Moses called it. Sure, it happened when Moses said it would. Sure, it stopped when Moses said it would stop. Sure, it impacted the Egyptians differently than it impacted the Israelites, but there's still something natural enough about it that left him unsure. When he asked the question, who is the Lord, that I should obey him? There's something very natural about the judgment that he brings to the land. But many times that's how God's judgment works. You see, if God wanted to get to the end of this story more quickly, we could have reduced all of this to like 10 verses and gotten to the liberation part real quick. I mean, think about it. What if Moses walked into Pharaoh's court with Aaron? He stands before him, he wiggles his nose, and Pharaoh's entire court turns into camels. And then he points his staff at Pharaoh and says, "You're next, Lawrence, let my people go." Or better yet, this would be better. What if Moses put on a big red cape and he walked into Pharaoh's court with a giant war hammer, and he holds it up to the sky and lightning strikes it, and then he slams it to the earth and a shock wave emanates out and all of Pharaoh's armed guard goes flying back, slamming into the wall, and they fall down dead. And then he flings his giant war hammer at Pharaoh and it flies towards him and it stops an inch away from his face. And Moses says, "I'm not asking again." I bet Pharaoh would have let him go, don't you? Wouldn't you think that would happen real quick if that happened? And they would have made way more money at the box office if they had approached it that way. But the point of the plagues is not a raw display of power. It is not to say that God is bigger than you. It is not to say that God is bigger and badder than your Egyptian gods. God is answering the question, who is the Lord that I should obey him? And the first answer God gives isn't, you should obey God because he's going to crush you. It's not the answer. If you pay attention to the 10 plagues, what you notice in chapters 7 through 12 is that they have been set up deliberately to reverse everything that we read in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we have the creation account. And we have man and woman and animals and fish and trees and oceans and land and sky and sun and moon and stars. And we have God. And everything lives in harmony. Everything lives in beauty. Everything moves in synchronicity with one another. And there is peace in the world, and there is peace in our hearts, and there is peace with God, and there is peace with creation and nature itself. That's what the Hebrews called shalom. Everything is the way it is supposed to be. It is peaceful. It is well with our souls. Everything lives in harmony. Everything lives in beauty. And what we see in the 10 plagues is creation itself beginning to unravel. Creation itself beginning to disintegrate. Creation itself collapsing on itself, reverting back into its form of pre-creation chaos. Nature is unraveling before Pharaoh's very eyes. In fact, by the end of the plagues, it has unraveled all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where we are told, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." It was formless, it was dark, it was empty, and nature is reverting back to that as Pharaoh disobeys the Lord and asks the question, why should I even obey him? Here's God's first answer to that question. My commands are not arbitrary. My law is not domineering. I am not throwing this stuff out because I am the playground bully who wants to prove he is stronger than you are and put you in your place. What God is saying here is, I have commands because I created the world to work in a certain way, and when you go against the grain of the fabric for which you were created, you're going against the grain of the universe itself. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's a 55-year-old man, and he goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have to cut back on the cholesterol. You have to drastically change your diet. Now, the man might not like her directive. The man might not listen to her directive, but there's a few things that the man won't say in response. First thing the man won't say when the doctor says, you need to change your diet. That's just a naked assertion of power, and you're trying to control my life. He's not going to say that. Neither is he going to say, so what, if I have bacon for breakfast, you're going to call the cops, right? He's not going to say that. Do you know why not? Because what the doctor has decreed is utterly natural. And if he violates her directive, he violates his own body. If he tramples on her directive, he tramples on his own health. What God tells us as command, what God gives us as a law, is not coming from a doctor who has studied how the body works. It is coming from the architect, the engineer, the designer, the creator, the maker, the manufacturer of all of life and existence itself. And he is giving these commands because he knows the design. And when we violate his commands, it is not because he wants our obedience to prove he's big or he's some insecure deity who needs peons to do his will. It's because he loves you. And to violate God's commands is to violate yourself. To trample on his law is to trample on yourself. A couple of examples. God tells us for our psychological and spiritual well-being, I have to be number one in your life. That's how you were created, for me to be number one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind. I have to be more important than your work. I have to be more important than your career. I have to be more important than your family. I have to be the most important thing. That's his command. But you might violate that command. You might trample on that command and make your career the most important thing. And if your career becomes your most important thing, more important than God, it will become your master. You will overwork. And as you overwork, your family at home will begin to disintegrate. Your relationships there will begin to disintegrate. As you overwork, the stress piles up and your health begins to disintegrate. And if something goes wrong with your career, emotionally you're undone, and your psychological well-being begins to disintegrate. You're turning back into dust. When we disobey God's commands, we emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically begin to unravel. God says you must forgive people who sin against you. And if you trample on that command, if you violate that command, you hold on to the grudge. The bitterness takes root in your heart. It begins to control you. It begins to impact all of your relationships. Emotionally, psychologically, you begin to unravel. You're turning back into dust. Dust you are, to dust you shall return. God doesn't give us commands to prove He's bigger and badder and stronger than us. He gives us commands because He loves you and He knows how you were made and He wants you to live in freedom and to thrive. So the first way that God answers the question, who is the Lord that I should obey Him? Here's our answer. The consequences of disobedience are natural. If you decide I'm not going to forgive, He's not going to strike you with lightning. If you say I'm not going to be generous, you're not going to get in a car crash the next day. It's a natural consequence because it's violating the essence of who you are. So that's God's first answer to the question. The second answer we see as we notice, and I'm just going to give you one example of how in the plagues God seems to be pulling His punches. Let me show you what I mean. In Exodus chapter 9, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, let my people go so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die.'" Here's the question. Why does God warn Pharaoh? Oh, by the way, storms are coming. Better get the cattle in. I mean, if the purpose is judgment, why doesn't He just let the hail fall? Hey, he deserves it. All of his stuff is going to be destroyed. Why plague after plague after plague does Moses appear before Pharaoh? Pharaoh, let my people go. No! All right, here's what's going to happen next. See ya. Every time that's going on. How come? Because again, the purpose is to answer the question, who is the Lord that I should obey Him? And this teaches us something about who God is and the judgment that He brings. Here's our next fill in the blank that we see from this section. The Lord is the God who judges to save. He is not judging because He's vindictive. He's not judging because He's saying, I'll show you. He's judging in order to save. Look at it. First of all, who's He saving? He's saving the Hebrews. He's bringing judgment to bring them liberation so they may be free from oppression. Second, who is He trying to save? Pharaoh and the Egyptians. That's why time after time He warns, He gives them a heads up. He doesn't just drop the hammer and destroy them all. He gradually increases severity. He warns them every time. In fact, we're told that by the end of the plagues, many of the Egyptians had come to fear the Lord. They're like, we don't care what Pharaoh thinks. We know that there is one God, and He is the Hebrew God. He is the Lord. Because God is trying to save them, not destroy them. And finally, who is God trying to save? God said in that section, I want all the earth to know that I am the Lord. And so all the earth heard these stories. Generation after generation for centuries, millions and billions of people have heard these stories, that they can see who God is. And He is a God who judges naturally, but He is also a God who judges in order to save. When you're feeling God's judgment, it's not because He's mad at you. It's not because He's trying to get you. God is not petty. He wants to save. He wants to turn us from our ways. Because of His love. He's the God who judges to save. Now, there's one more answer to the question we have in the plagues. Who is the Lord that I should obey Him? And we're going to see it in the 9th plague, Exodus chapter 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt. Darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, go, worship the Lord, even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind. But Moses said, you must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. I am totally uncomfortable with that expression, okay? Like, we're going to leave one hoof behind here. Anyway, that's how my brain works. We have to use some of them in worshiping the Lord our God, and until we get there, we will not know what we are to use in worship to the Lord. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Pharaoh said to Moses, get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. Just as you say, Moses replied, I will never appear before you again. Now, there's one more plague coming after this one. And this one is so important, the 10th one, that after our little recess, that's where we're going to resume the life of Moses. And I'm going to spend a whole Sunday talking about the 10th plague. It's that important. But for this one, the 9th one, the plague of darkness, biblically speaking, this had to be the 9th plague. God had no other choice than to make darkness the penultimate plague. And here's why. Throughout the Scriptures, darkness is symbolic of God's judgment. It is symbolic of God's judgment by withdrawing entirely from people and leaving them outside of His presence. Jesus, when He taught about hell, and Jesus did teach about hell, He described it as a place of darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's darkness because God has withdrawn His presence. And many people really struggle with that idea, and I totally understand why. How could a loving God cast people into hell? In Pharaoh, we see the prototype of how that works. He disobeys. God comes back. He puts up a wall. No. Finally, God says, okay. As you say, I'll never appear before you again. In a sense, hell is God saying, your will be done, to people who their entire lives have said, my will be done. But darkness is symbolic throughout the Scriptures of God's judgment. So before the final plague, God brings 3 days of darkness that is so dark you could feel it. I don't know if you've ever been in a place that dark where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. It is unnerving. It is unraveling. And it had to end this way because this was the first thing God created in Genesis 1. He created His light. And so finally, as Egypt disintegrates, the last thing to go out is the light, and the darkness settles in. But there's one more thing that the narrator wants us to see here. There's one other place in the Bible where there is darkness so unnatural that it could be felt. And it came from the life of Jesus. Look at what Matthew wrote in Matthew chapter 27 about Jesus. He said, "From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land." Now, Matthew wrote that in a way that intentionally was parallel with the 9th plague. Darkness fell over the whole land. This time not for 3 days, this time for 3 hours, as Jesus Christ was hanging on the cross from noon to 3, a deep darkness fell over the land. And about 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because God the Father forsook and abandoned his Son Jesus on the cross because Jesus was being crucified under God's wrath, bearing the judgment for sin in your place. For all of our disobedience, for all of the times we justify why we disobey God, for all of the times when we have asked, consciously or subconsciously, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" Jesus said, "I will bear the consequence of that sin. I will bear the judgment for that sin." And Jesus, the judge of all mankind, became judged in our place. Jesus, the maker of all creation, became unmade on the cross so that through his forgiveness we could be remade to live in God's presence. And that's God's final answer to today's question. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? The Lord is the God who was judged to save. He is the God who judges naturally. He is the God who judges to save. And best of all, he is the God who was judged to save. So, where does this land with you? 3 things for you to take away today as you apply this in your life, because this land's different for all of us. Number 1, identify one area of your life that feels like chaos. What feels chaotic in your life? Is it finances? Is it marriage? Is it work? Just pick one. What feels chaotic right now? Second, are there any ways that you are disobeying God in that area? When we violate God's law, we violate our very selves. So are there any ways you are disobeying God in that area of your life? You might say, well, yeah, but it's 80% someone else's fault. Granted, it's 80% someone else's fault. What's the 20% that you are disobeying God in that area of your life and unleashing chaos into your own life and into the lives of other people? How are you unmaking God's creative order in your own life through your disobedience of the Lord? He's the God who judges naturally. Are there any ways that you are disobeying God? Last question, or point, take the first step of obedience. Take the first step in that chaotic area and say, God, I've been doing this my way. I haven't been doing it your way. I'm taking one step of obedience. And whatever that looks like in that area for your life, God, I trust you. You're the maker. You are the judge. You judge to save, and you were judged to save, so I trust you. Take that first step of obedience. That's God's answer to the question, who is the Lord that I should obey him? He's amazing. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, we are so thankful that you don't come unhinged. That when people disobey you, you just don't throw down lightning bolts and unleash raw displays of power and vengeance. You are not a petty God. You are a gracious and compassionate God. You are slow to anger. You are abounding in love. You do not treat us as our sins deserve. You do not repay us according to our sin. Thank you that through this encounter that Pharaoh had with you, that we all get our question answered of who are you, Lord? And you are a God who loves us so much that you judge to save, and Jesus, you were judged on the cross to save us. How could we ever do anything but love you? How could we ever do anything but gladly obey you? Father, for our times of deliberate disobedience that have unleashed chaos into our lives or in the lives of the people we love, we're sorry. Forgive us of our sins. Forgive us of our disobedience. Forgive us for acting as if we are God in your place. Help us to see your unfailing love for us through Jesus Christ. And give us the humility and the courage, wherever our lives have been chaotic, to take the first step to obey you. We ask this for your glory and our good. In Jesus' name, amen.